In this video, I'll take a look at this brand new Tamron 150-600mm zoom lens. Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. And in this video, I'll take a look at this brand new Tamron 150-500mm telephoto zoom lens. And when you see this video, this lens should be available for you to buy if you are interested. This kind of a long telephoto zoom lens is obviously targeted for wildlife shooters and bird shooters, and I'm not a wildlife photographer and I'm not a bird photographer, but I still wanted to try this lens for two reasons. First, I haven't used a super or telephoto zoom like this for a long time, and second, I haven't used a Tamron lens for a long time, so I was eager to see how this performs and how it handles. And because this is a wildlife lens, I shot some flying birds to see how the autofocus performs. And by the way, the camera body that I have is the Sony Alpha 1 or A1, and this lens is available so far only for Sony camera, Sony FE mount. And when I was shooting those flying birds, I also compared the Tamron to the Sony 200-600mm lens to see if there's any difference in the autofocus performance or their capabilities or abilities to follow a flying bird. And then I went to the zoo to get some fake wildlife pictures and see how sharp this Tamron lens is. And before I go any further, a disclaimer: this Tamron zoom lens is on loan from Focus Nordic Finland. They are the official Tamron representative here in Finland, and the camera, the Sony Alpha 1 and the Sony zoom lens, they are on loan from Sony Finland. And big thanks to Focus Nordic and Sony for letting me borrow this gear so I can make this video for you guys. And before we go to the zoo, let's take a look at the build quality of this lens, which feels really good. It feels like most of the material is some sort of composite, but it's really hard to tell because of the coating or whatever paint they apply on the surface of this lens. But it feels really good, and there's no unnecessary free play, even if you zoom out, even if the lens is fully zoomed out. The lens hood and tripod collar are both included, and the tripod collar has Arca Swiss compatible mounting plate, so you can mount this on a tripod without any extra accessories, as long as you have Arca Swiss compatible head on your tripod. This weighs in just under 2 kilograms with the tripod collar and the hood, and the filter size is 82 millimeters. And of course this is weather sealed, which is a big bonus, especially if you are out in the wild trying to capture some wildlife. You don't want to stop shooting even if it starts to rain. The zoom ring is really smooth, and there's a very handy zoom lock. You can just push out the zoom ring just a little bit and it locks at any focal length. And that is really handy because there might be a situation where you want to keep your focal length throughout the whole shoot, and this makes it possible to not to accidentally change the focal length in whatever situation. On the side of the lens there are 4 switches, one for the focus limiter and then another one for the manual focus autofocus switch, and then 2 for the image stabilizer. And all in all, I found the handling relatively nice. This is a big and relatively or a little bit heavy lens, but I still didn't find this uncomfortable to handhold even for a little bit longer periods of time. But of course, in real wildlife photo situation, you probably want to support this lens on a tripod or a monopod so you can relax while you're waiting for your subject to appear. And for some situations, even 500mm is not enough. And for those situations, you may want to use a teleconverter. However, to my knowledge, there is no compatible teleconverter for this lens. So for some of you, that might be a deal breaker or a major downside at least. Because sometimes it is really difficult to get close enough to a real wild animal in real nature. I went to the zoo and it's easy to get close enough there, most of the time at least, but in real nature sometimes you may need more than 500mm. But of course, if you're using a 50 megapixel camera like I did, or even higher megapixel camera like the Sony A7R Mark IV, I think that has more than 60 megapixels, you have a lot of room to crop. But anyway, if you need a teleconverter, this is not the lens for you. Based on my experience in the zoo, I'd say the autofocus was really super fast and accurate. And also the animal detect autofocus worked really well with this lens, and the autofocus was able to find the eye of the animal even if the animal was relatively small in the frame. So in those situations, I'd say the performance of this lens was really good, and also my pictures turned out really sharp, and I was impressed how sharp this lens is at all focal lengths and all apertures. Of course, as with any lens, when you stop down far enough, you will get diffraction, and that is going to soften your picture. But with this kind of a lens, you mostly shoot at wide open or almost wide open aperture, and this lens performed really, really well. I was really impressed by the sharpness of this lens, even on a 50 megapixel camera or with a 50 megapixel sensor. However, those fairly static animals in the zoo are a relatively easy target or subject for the autofocus and also for the photographer. And I wanted to see how this performs for flying birds, because those are really, really super difficult subject, and it's also super difficult to get any kind of repeatable, consistent results with flying birds, and it's even more difficult when you try to compare two lenses and get consistent, repeatable results on both lenses so you can compare the autofocus performance. And this test that I did, it's only one test, and I don't think you can draw any definitive conclusions based on that, but we can draw some conclusion based on that. And to find flying birds, I took a ferry from Helsinki Market Square to one of the islands. It's about a 15-minute ferry trip, and there are usually a lot of seabirds following the ferry. And it's a fairly like a guaranteed place to take pictures of flying birds. And it's also a fairly good place to get repeatable, consistent pictures of flying birds. And on my way to the island, I shot on this Tamron lens, and on my return trip, I shot on the Sony lens. And based on those results, I'd say the Sony lens probably was a little bit better at keeping the birds in focus. But the difference between the Tamron and the Sony was not that big. I'd say that the Tamron was probably 10 or 15% better, or was able to get me 10 or 15% more keepers than the Tamron. So the Tamron did really well in that particular test. But I'm gonna say it one more time that this is only one test, and to fully find out which lens is better would require much more shooting in different conditions, different environments and different situations. But I didn't have time to do all that, but I did the best I could. And I have to say I was really impressed with both lenses, and I was able to get quite a few quite good pictures and tack sharp pictures. And the biggest challenge for me was just to keep the bird in the frame, especially when you are at 500 or 600 millimeters and the bird comes close so it fills the full frame or the whole frame. It's really difficult to keep the bird in the frame in the first place, because those wild birds, they can all of a sudden change their direction, or they can dive or do whatever stunts they want to do. This Tamron also has fairly decent close-up capabilities. It can focus down to 0.6 meters at 150mm setting, and you can get some fairly tight close-ups with this lens, but of course this does not replace a dedicated macro lens. The image stabilizer is fairly effective, and when I made some tests here at home, I was able to get fairly constant repeatable results at 1/30th of a second shutter speed at the longest focal length, 500 millimeters. But when I went to longer than that shutter speeds, my results deteriorated really quickly, and I was not able to get any kind of decent results handheld. But I still think 1/30th of a second is pretty impressive on a 500 millimeter focal length and 50 megapixel sensor, which reveals even the smallest motion blur or camera shake. And while it's important to have a stabilizer on a lens like this, it's good to remember that most of the time if you're shooting wildlife, the wildlife is moving more or less, and you can't probably shoot at 1/30th of a second shutter speed anyway. But it's good to know that you can if the situation requires that. And of course, image stabilizer performance is highly personal. Your results may be better or worse than mine, depending on how stable your hands are. The price over in the United States seems to be around $1,400 US. Over here in Europe, the price is a little bit more. Seems to be around 1,500–1,600 euros. And the Sony lens, this 200-600 zoom, seems to be around 2,000 over here, 2,000 euros over here in Europe, and $2,000 over in the United States. So in the United States, this Tamron is a little bit more appealing because the price difference between this and the Sony is a bit more than over here in Europe. And here in Europe, I think the choice between the Tamron and the Sony is a little bit more difficult. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.